Trouble don't you find no home by me. Oh my Lord, if you're listening, tell them go ahead and get going.
Every day, we see new problems. And the old solutions just can't keep up. We need new solutions that grow exponentially, outpacing even the biggest problems. The question is, how do we get there? If you're a tech entrepreneur today, you have access to powerful support.
I will make you an offer for the full £200,000.
And if you make it big, the world is at your feet.
He can pull that off, I can't.
What if the entrepreneurs using technology to create positive impact would get the same treatment? Shouldn't they? At Norrsken, these are the tech entrepreneurs we support. Our fund invests in the tech entrepreneurs with the greatest chance of having a positive impact. Our co-working space gives them a workplace with everything they need to grow.
If we offer you the best space in the world, then you can do the best work in the world.
Our partners provide them with resources and experience. With the right investments and the right space, we want to make sure that the best impact entrepreneurs have the best chance of succeeding. Because in the end, it's really quite simple. If they win, we all win.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric. I am the CEO of Norrsken, and together with this incredible team that we have here, I have the great privilege to welcome you to this evening that we are arranging together with the Right Livelihood Foundation. You know, these kind of evenings wouldn't be possible without the support and backing of our partners. And they don't only help out our entrepreneurs who sit here with advice, but they enable conversations like this today as well. So if you leave here tonight feeling slightly smarter, slightly more inspired than when you came here, remember to think about them and not Norrsken. So thank you, partners, for this. Tonight, we are going to dive deep into some of the most pressing issues of our time. Questions that are shaping society as we speak. Questions like, where do you draw the line between individual privacy and collective security? Questions like, if you know that an individual, civil servant, politician, or even a government is corrupt, what should you do when people of power abuse their power? Questions like, what can I as an individual citizen do to drive change? Or what can I do to be the catalyst of change? So tonight we have some of the most interesting, world-renowned, leading speakers, activists, to help us go through these questions. And I hope that you leave here feeling both a little bit provoked and super inspired at the same time. Normally at an event like this is when someone pulls up their phone and say, remember to switch it off. But I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to encourage you to keep this on, maybe on mute, but use this to engage tonight, because this is your opportunity to ask all the kinds of questions that you wanted to ask. And the moderators will use Slido, this fantastic tool, to incorporate all your questions. You can upvote them into the conversations as we go along. So remember to use this. And basically that leads me to immediately welcome the first speaker of the night on stage. This is a man who is a personal hero of mine, who on a daily basis risks his life to improve conditions not only for the citizens of Ghana, where he comes from, but for people throughout Western Africa. He's a man whose work has been celebrated by people like Obama, Kofi Annan, but even more, his work is leading to the direct impact and improvement of corruption, slavery, abuse. So we have a short video to introduce our next speaker, Anas, to the stage. But please join me in welcoming Anas to the stage after the movie. He's come here all the way from Ghana, and he's a living hero of our time.
Across Africa, we've seen countless examples of people taking control of their destiny and making change from the bottom up. We see that spirit in courageous journalists like Anas Aremeyaw Aremeyaw Anas, who risked his life to report the truth.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. My name is Anas Aremeyaw Anas. I'm an undercover journalist from Ghana. I have been doing undercover for the last 17 years. Perhaps one of the key things that I take into consideration whenever I get on the field is to do things differently. So whereas my colleagues would name and shame, I do three main things. I name, shame, and jail. Wait a minute. I know some people are going to get a bit uncomfortable because that's not the normal practice in journalism. We usually say that the role of a journalist is to name and shame, tell the story as it is and go away. I do journalism differently. I use the hidden camera and I gather evidence. I gather hardcore evidence and I call the police and law enforcement agencies, and these bad guys are arrested. Then I go to the court of law where I stand and I testify to make sure that these bad guys are jailed. Over the years, I've played many roles undercover. I've been a prison inmate in prison. I've been a patient at the psychiatric hospital. I've been a woman. I've been a nurse, I've been a pimp. I've played many, many roles, and I've worked for many organizations, including the BBC, Al Jazeera, and many more. But why do I do what I do? I do it because of the simple reason that institutions in Africa are not strong enough to be able to withhold or hold the shocks that come from the bad guys. Whereas perhaps when you do your pieces of work here, your police, your judiciary will have the capacity to be able to stand and hold these crimes and hold the people accountable. It's a different story in Africa. So I take one step forward and I meet the law enforcement agencies to ensure that the bad guys are put behind bars. And I'm not talking about something that I am about to practice. I talk about something that I have done and have seen the results. When you look at the Chinese human trafficking story that I did, the people are in jail for 45 years. When you look at the Nana Kwesi Agyeman story, a man who raped girls as young as 3 years, he's in jail for 15 years. When you look at the cocoa smuggling story, they are in jail for 16 years all put together. So you see, I am talking about journalism that brings real change to society. We will start with these few examples. Then we will start thinking through the process and see that if you were in my position, what would you do? I know some would definitely disagree that this kind of journalism is unheard of. But hey, we are moving a society. We are looking for impact in society. Human lives are lost every single day. We have to be ingenious and cannot be dogmatic in our approach to solving problems within our society. What is the essence of journalism if it doesn't lead to progress in our society? These videos would show us, if you were in some of these situations, what you would do. The stories that come to mind immediately would be the story that I did when I went undercover in a place we will call Tanzania. In Tanzania, there was the issue of the albinos. Human arms were being chopped left, right, and center. I had to go undercover. And when I went undercover, it was not easy. As you can see on the screens, I'm sorry, it's not easy to watch these things, but I have to tell you the reality of the situation. And we had to stand firm. And at the end of the day, built a prosthetic arm, which I used in frightening these guys. And as we speak now, the guy you see on the television, who usually would chop the arms of this albino, is in jail as we speak. Now, you look forward and you think through processes, you realize that there are people who have set up and have made up their minds that they will always commit bad things in society. Now, the slides you are seeing is a demonstration of how some people have decided to make evil their deed in our society. Now, food for thought is a story for pregnant women and people who couldn't afford some food in society. And again, I was undercover. This is food supplied by the World Food Program. And here's it. People go steal them. Yet when I go undercover and I film all these atrocities, then you tell me my methods are not good? If they are not, what else do you expect me to do under this condition, where people who are put in respectable positions to take action do not take those actions? See, we come from different societies and we find answers to the problems we have differently. Now, as you could see on the screen, these are people who steal, and they steal food meant for malnourished kids. And so when you put us in positions like this and we turn journalism around, you don't come around accusing us or not practicing proper journalism. My journalism has always been done taking into consideration the laws that goes a long way to improve journalism. Now, what you are seeing on screen is Nigerians fake doctors. Doctors who go and then through abortions, they would, patients who are brought there are not properly treated, and a lot of human rights abuse is going on. This happened in Nigeria. Then again, I went undercover. That's where you see people exploiting people's human rights abuse. The bad guys, then again, I collaborated with the police. All those bad guys were then arrested on that day. And as we speak, these guys are behind bars. Look, we all ought to learn to have innovation in us, in the various societies that we live in. That's the only way we can impact. We have to change our modules depending on the surrounding circumstances and issues that affects those societies that we live in. I am saying that my journalism may look unconventional to you people, but I can tell you, back home in Africa, back home in Nigeria, back home in South Africa, it's working. That is justice. 34 judges, over 100 judicial staff caught in bribery. This is a story I did for Al Jazeera, and it came with a lot of problems, a lot of attacks on our lives, but we were focused. We knew that the only way to rid society and make society better is to be able to ask questions whether judges who play the role as gods in the guise of men are actually playing those roles. So then again, I went undercover with my team. 34 judges were filmed. Over 100 of them, judicial staff, were also caught taking bribes. This turned Ghana's judiciary. And at the end of the day, what do we have? We have a society where you've gotten rid of bad governance, people who are supposed to stand up and be counted, taking advantage of the poor. There were people who had issues of being taken to court over murder, where judges easily allowed them to go because they had been paid. Maybe we should all roll our minds back that how did the Hutus and Tutsis start back in those days? If there was a fair judge who did the right thing, I am sure that we wouldn't have found ourselves in those murky situations. So it doesn't really matter What matters is, are you making that real change in your society? Are you being able to impact positively? Are you taking your journalism as a tool to ensure that your people who live with you in society are living the best of lives? That has been the issue. Now, recently I got into a story which brought in FIFA, the Confederation of African Football. It's all about football. When I was young in the barracks, one day I was called that there was an incident happening within the hospital. I went to the hospital, and I can tell you 127 people had been killed. What was it that killed them? It was football. There was poor officiating. So what people had done was they attacked and fought each other in the stadium, and people died as a result. As an investigative reporter, I took my cameras together with my team. We went undercover, and this film called Betraying the Games aired on BBC a few months ago, where we found over 100 football officials taking bribes. We found 16 countries involved in this bribe taking in Africa, and the top person within FIFA also got suspended as a result of the work. As we speak, there's a lot of change that has happened as a result of that particular story. 61 referees have been fired. In Ghana, many more on the African continents have been fired by the Confederation of African Football. There's now some sanity. But do we say that's it? No. We still must have the capacity and the strength to push the frontiers of our democracy. It saddens my heart. I remember when I went undercover in the prison and the kind of things I saw, where it was not easy for people to find food to eat. The same story that led me to the psychiatric hospital as a patient, where it was not easy for people to just stand up and be counted. Ladies and gentlemen, I know we don't live the same worlds, but I can tell you, what I do is a product of my society. Corruption and human rights abuses are extreme diseases. And when you have extreme diseases within a society, you need an extreme remedy. Extreme remedies are the most appropriate for extreme diseases. Thank you very much. Okay. Do I take questions? Do I take questions?
No, you can stay on stage.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right. Thank you.
So a reminder, if you have any questions that you would like to ask Anas, just put it on Slido and I'll ask them on your behalf. But to start with, maybe Anas, how are you leveraging technology in your work? Obviously you have some hidden cameras, but what else are you doing in that regard?
Well, technology has been a very important tool helping us, especially in African countries where you publish a particular piece and then governments or other people would want to come after you, both the bad guys in society. So we've been looking for a strong partnership that would ensure that we are able to put together some of these information out there to society. We are also able to cross-check. And so that's one of the main reasons why I came here, to partner with Clarity, as we've been working over the past months, to have a solid platform where information bordering on human rights, corruption, and many forms of abuses on the continent would be shared for people to take part in. So indeed, yes, such backdrops are very, very important for us, such platform, because they make us impenetrable, because people are unable to attack us, and they give voice to people who otherwise in society wouldn't have had the energy to be able to speak up and be counted.
How easy has it been to get government and institutions to act on the cases that you present to them? Have they been welcoming or?
Well, of course, no government will be happy if you are criticizing it and you are exposing the wrongs. But the power is in the people, it's in civil society. That's why you need a platform that is engaging, where you can have people participate, where you can cross-check facts, align it with each other, and be sure that what you are churning out lies in the people's interest. Because don't forget that just as we push the frontiers to do good things, there are many bad people out there who also plot to push against us. So one of the biggest problems you will find yourself in is in legal suit, because you haven't cross-checked your facts. And so we try, we do what we can to ensure that we look at all this.
So Albin has a question here. What is the most common argument against your work? Because it's so easy for us to sit here and see the impact you're having, but how is it received in Ghana, for example?
Well, I mean, when I'm breaking my story, it's almost like a national holiday. Everybody comes to watch, and we premiere it for free for all citizens. We take it to the villages, we do a road show, we go to the university. But it's a big event whenever my story is coming out. And also because of the collaborations I've had with international media, it also helps sense the way. So it's quite welcoming. But then we still have people who critique undercover journalism because they think that it's an invasion of people's privacy and all that, forgetting the fact that undercover is always a last resort. I mean, people complain that because we hold the hidden camera, we'll one day come to you people in your bedrooms and film you. I keep saying that if you go and plan a coup to kill your president in your bedroom, it doesn't become a private matter. It becomes an issue of absolute interest to the public. So do the right thing in your bedroom, and we will not be there. It's as simple as that. So indeed, privacy and all those issues come up, but undercover would always be the last resort. And before we decide to go undercover, we have to obtain a prima facie evidence of you not only committing the crime at that time, but you being in the habit of committing that crime. And it is only when you have this that you are allowed to go undercover and film.
Thank you. So the last question from the audience here is, how do you see the role or importance of public service providers, like, for example, BBC, in the way that you work?
It's a 50-50 chance. Because sometimes your BBCs, your CNN, your Al Jazeeras do not want to tell the story that you want your people to hear. Other times you are just lucky that this is on the minds of your people and it is here being told. So we ride along, because sometimes when they are with you, it gives you an insulation so that governments are unable to attack you. But all in all, it's not their country. If you have to build your country, you don't expect someone to come from the BBC to come and build Sweden. No. Sweden will be for Swedish. And if the people of Sweden decide not to build it, it's their business. Same applies to me. If we decide not to build Africa with the tools and talents that we have, who else will? We should not go around blaming the BBC and CNN. It is our responsibility to kick out human rights abuse and to kick out corruption to make our continent a better place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do you need help?
I'm sure I've done well.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Elisa. I'm the CEO of Clarity. And a few years ago, Thank you, Anas. Please have a seat. Please, another round of applause for Anas. Thank you. Such an honor to have him here. A few years ago, when our founder, Niklas, was still at Klarna, researching what could create the most impact, he came across a quote from the president of the World Bank saying that in the developing world, corruption is the public enemy #1, standing in the way of development and economic growth. Huge problem. We met with Anas and we learned about the fact that people don't tend to report everyday corruption. They don't report that policeman, the doctor, or the teacher that asks them for bribes anymore because they've simply lost trust in the system and they don't think that any action will be taken. But they're also afraid of disclosing their identity if they would go on and report. We also learned, we were struck by this challenge, of course, but we've also seen the possibility in the leapfrogging that emerging countries have done with smartphone penetration. Anas told us how young people contact him through social media on a daily basis to share leads about corruption that is going on and to also ask how they can help stop corruption. Of course, this is a great opportunity, and this is where Clarity comes in. We want to give those passionate young activists the opportunity to fight corruption that is happening in their everyday life by providing them with the latest technology, the best digital tools to expose this. Let's see. That's why I'm extremely proud today. Let's see if we can move over to my slides. There we go. I'm extremely proud today, now that Anas is also visiting us here in Stockholm, to launch the platform Je suis Anas together. With this platform, we can engage anyone to expose corruption from their everyday life, to share their stories, and to follow up and make sure that the institutions take action on this. Je suis Anas went live today with over hundreds of videos of football corruption and the status of each case. With the camera recording tool, anyone can secretly and safely record corruption and share it to people and expose it until institutions take action. That's how we empower and engage a grassroots movement to be able to take action. Ghana is just the first step of our work. From here, we want to take the platform out in the world and engage a grassroots movement in other countries as well. And I'm extremely proud over the team that we have that is building this platform. We're 9 people, engineers, programmers, and designers with great experience of building digital tools. A great team. We're fully financed and owned by the Norrsken Foundation. And now that we're ready to take this out to the world, we hope to find more support and partnerships and donations, maybe even here tonight. This is basically how we do it. We find the best activists, whistleblowers, and organizations in the world fighting corruption, and we empower them with the latest technology to help them expose and expose again and follow up and engage all different stakeholders to put pressure on the institutions to act. Because the problem today is that these cases are ignored and forgotten. But with these tools, our role is to make sure that they are being exposed and followed up. And that's how we want to fight public enemy #1. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Ole von Uxkull is my name, director of the Right Livelihood Award, also called the Alternative Nobel Prize. Thank you very much for having us. We're very proud about this cooperation with Norrsken Foundation. I'll give you a little background about our organization in just a couple of minutes, but before that, I would like to introduce a video that we did just a couple of days ago with our last year's laureate Khadija Ismayilova from Azerbaijan, who is also an investigative journalist who won the award last year for uncovering corruption in Azerbaijan. And we asked her some of the questions that we're discussing tonight. Here's Khadija.
I'm Khadija Ismayilova. I'm an investigative journalist. I work with Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. What I do is uncovering corruption facts in Azerbaijan. And I'm a Right Livelihood Award laureate of 2017. We constantly feel tapped in this country. There are laws that allow the government to interfere to our digital communication, including the phone conversations and the computer communications. But sometimes the government goes even further than those regulations, and they bypass requirements of law to get the permission of the court to monitor someone's digital communication, and they basically interfere to our privacy without any legal rules observed. The government used actually the anti-terrorism law to install camera in my bedroom and have the local telephone station to basically to provide all this technology to watch my bedroom. So this is what happened to me. For us investigative journalists, it is more difficult and more complicated because human rights defenders and political activists, they mostly risk with their own security. In our case, it's also the security of our whistleblowers. So we have to care about their security and their safety more than our own, because eventually I will write the story and the government will know about me writing this story. But the whistleblower, him or her, I should be careful not to expose. And it's more difficult to get them on the safe side, and especially for the people who are exposed already, as if I go somewhere or meet someone, it's clear that it's not for a nice story. So whenever I go for interview, they understand that I'm not known as a journalist who writes nice stories. So it always raises red flags. So I'm trying to avoid one-to-one communication. I try to work through proxies. For example, in Belarus, in Azerbaijan, there were reported cases of the big companies like TeliaSonera working with the government to provide personal information and digital information of the people whom the government considered as their critics. And in some cases, these actions had not been even supported by the court decisions, and they've been done illegally. it was a practice, basically generally accepted practice in Telesonera, to pay bribes to dictators and then to get permission to work in the country and then to give full access to its premises and data to authoritarian regimes. I think it is a time for all the digital service providers, including the cell phone, the cell phone communication providers and IT companies, to develop the guideline, ethics guideline for themselves and agree on that. And it should be a globally accepted document, and that should outline that authoritarian regimes, if they are recognized as such by leading human rights organizations, these companies should not sell them their programs.
So that website is where you can learn more about Khadija, but also about more than 150 other laureates from around the world, from more than 70 countries who've received this award since 1980. And we would all agree in this room that we live in very challenging times. The IPCC just told us a week ago that we have maybe 10 years left to completely redesign our economy to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. At the same time, we see that the mutual trust in our societies is declining and political institutions get less and less respect. But these are, of course, also very exciting times to live in, and that is why the Right Livelihood Award exists, to support and highlight those who provide practical and exemplary solutions in this time of crisis. There's this saying that a falling tree makes more noise than a growing forest, and we're always focused on the falling trees, the catastrophes that are happening around us. But the force of the growing solutions is really just as strong. And we get nominations for the award. Everybody in the world can propose everyone in the beginning of every year. We research them, we go and visit them around the world, and then we announce 4 laureates every year in September. So right now we're gearing up to this year's award presentation in Stockholm in just 4 weeks from now, with 4 amazing laureates from Guatemala, from Saudi Arabia, from Burkina Faso, and from Australia. With this work and with the open nominations, we're kind of a global trend scout. We find and highlight new solutions before they've reached the mainstream. That is why the Right Livelihood Award is also sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, because we find laureates before the work is really widely accepted. And then it also happens that sometimes our laureates do receive Nobel Prizes later. We were very happy just 2 weeks ago when the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway announced that Dr. Mukwege is the award recipient this year, who received the Right Livelihood Award a number of years ago. And then on the other hand, we ask ourselves, have we become too conventional now? Are we part of the mainstream? And then luckily, there are also laureates like the one we're meeting tonight, who received the Right Livelihood Award in 2014 and at the same time was wanted for 30 years in prison by Nobel Peace Laureate Barack Obama, who we saw earlier on the screen, who shared with a global public what he knew was morally wrong, and who challenged the most powerful government in the world in doing so, and who accepted the likely prospect of a lifetime in prison or worse. Ed Snowden is not just the greatest whistleblower of all times. He's also a world-leading expert on counter-surveillance and secure communication. And it's this knowledge and his wonderful skill and patience in explaining difficult technical solutions that he's now putting at the service of journalists and civil society as president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. So what better person to discuss tonight's question with? What is our privacy worth? Please give a very warm welcome to Ed Snowden from Moscow.
Good to be with you. Can you hear me?
Welcome to Stockholm.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Hopefully, one of these days I'll get there in person.
That's what we really hope for, and what we've been asking the Swedish government about repeatedly. But that's not what we're discussing here tonight. My ambition is to cover 3 larger topics with you. We want to talk about our privacy as Swedish citizens who've done nothing wrong. We want to talk about your work with journalists, and we want to talk about the digital security of human rights defenders. And I told you when we were sound checking here earlier that when we came in here to the room, there were like 40 or 50 fake cameras, by the way, toy cameras directed on us. But there are real threats to our privacy. Who in this nice little country, who is wanting to compromise our privacy, and why?
There are a lot of ways of looking at this. The one that I'm sort of best known for talking about, of course, are the governments. Things like Sweden's FRA and its domestic investigative equivalents. But it's not really just about governments. And this is something that so many people forget, particularly people in societies like Sweden, where there is a very high, some might even say too high, level of trust in government officials, right? Functionaries of all levels, and of course, politicians. And this is because institutions have developed in such a way that they don't have to be governmental to impact and influence, and in some cases, increasingly shape people's lives. We're talking about Google, we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about financial services companies and banks, any kind of data broker. Now, all of us every day as we go about our lives, doing nothing wrong, simply living and being, are shedding a trail of records. If you have a cell phone in your pocket right now, for example, you're leaving a more or less permanent record of your presence in this room at this event. And this is because the nature of the way our systems work. They were designed, for example, the cell phone network, decades and decades ago, when the sheer idea of mass surveillance was not even yet a theory. And because there were no protections baked into the design, baked into the architecture, it meant as technology progressed, as government agencies sort of blazed new trail, of course, justifying everything as defense against terrorism, saying that they're saving lives, just as we saw in the case of Khadija in her message just now. Governments always use anti-terrorism laws against people who are not terrorists, right? But this typically happens in secret, and we don't learn about the abuses for years, possibly decades. But the techniques, the methods, tend to be cross-pollinated in secret into industry. And the FRA officer retires from his primary career, and he sets up a small business, a consulting shop. He helps a friend. And eventually what happens is these methods make their way into private industry. Now, this is the world we live in today, where actually the greatest portion of surveillance that's happening most aggressively it can be seen in commercial forces. And it's because they're tracking not just where your cell phone is going, they're tracking all the apps that you're using, when you're using them, who you're using them to contact, what you're purchasing, what you're searching, what you're seeking. Tim Cook, actually the CEO of Apple, who himself is not blameless, but is actually doing quite better than the rest of his peers in the industry when it comes to data collection. Said your wishes and fears, your hopes and dreams, all of these things are being recorded by his competitors, of course, because he says Apple is not an advertising company. And he's more or less right? Again, they're not perfect. They have a lot of flaws. But other companies aggressively reject this kind of ethos, this presumption that business and morality have anything to do with one another. And this brings us to that question that you mentioned, which is just what does our privacy mean? And privacy, if you want to take it out of abstract terms and put it into something more concrete, because most people don't understand what privacy is power. Privacy represents the amount of liberty, the amount of freedom, the amount of trust that the individual enjoys from society, from government, from industry. And I'm not sure we have ever lived in a time where an individual has had less of this kind of power. At the same time, we have all of these, again, organized institutions aggregating as much information about us, as many records about our lives, so they can inform their decisions and influence our thinking in the same way. So what we have seen with this loss of privacy is a redistribution of power away from the community, away from the individual, who is really the public, atomized, and into the hands of organized factions. And the concern that I have, and I think we see certainly coming to sharp clarity in the more authoritarian regions of the world, is that this redistribution of power is not being applied for the benefit of the public.
Now, the problem is that we're not just being our privacy and our power, in your words, is not just being taken away from us by companies. Actually, we give it away without a lot of concern. I mean, we feed the data machine. Have we lost the appreciation for our privacy and our freedom?
Well, I mean, that's a very popular argument, and it's a very common one. And on some level, people sort of nod their head and think, yes, okay. But do you actually know what records Facebook holds on you right now? Do you know exactly the kind of analytics that are being applied by your phone company right now? What your internet service provider has saved regarding your communications? And for almost everyone in the room, the answer is no. You may think you know in general terms, right? You might have an idea, but you don't know with specificity. These things aren't made available to you. You don't see them. And this is an intentional strategy. It's to basically prevent people from understanding the costs of the bargain into which they've obligated themselves. And in Silicon Valley, of course, this is described as frictionless design, right? They say people prefer to use systems that are easy, that don't give them too much choice, that don't provide them with too much information, that don't reveal very much complexity. They just make it very simple. They show you a little window, you press a button, then dancing cats, right? It's right there. The joys are instantaneous, and the costs are hidden, and they're not made. You're not made aware of these for years and years and years until you have paid so much without knowing it. Until they have so much information into you that then you feel, well, they already know everything about me anyway. So what does it do for me if I back out at this point? My phone company knows everything about me. Facebook knows everything about me. Google has everything I've ever typed into this search box. Even if I try to cut myself away from the system, too much is known, right? And this is why I think that argument is not as solid as its proponents think it is. It is a false presentation that this was a free and knowing choice. rather than an easy choice. Frictionless design basically means front-loading the joy and back-loading the cost.
And then, of course, we call for better regulation, right? And Europe has been going through a longer legislative process. We introduced this new directive on data, where we've all received loads and loads of emails earlier this year, how our records were being treated or no longer being treated. And regulation has its space, right? But it also has its limitations.
Yeah, so this is like with GDPR, of course, the privacy regulation you're referring to. This is a positive step forward. It's what we want to believe in. It's the kind of thing that is really sort of a mechanism of last resort. But it's become necessary because we have seen the level of abuse is so extreme among the Facebooks of the world that we have to apply every tool, every lever, every mechanism of influence that we have in order to just keep our head above water, right? It's not like this provided us a new universe of sort of perfect harmony. It just made the slide into hell a little bit slower. And so in this, why is that the case, right? Why are these limitations? Why aren't they delivering us the kind of thing we want? And the first, and I think most striking example of this is the reluctance of regulators, once they have sort of asserted that they have this authority to regulate, to actually use it. And GDPR famously threatens 4% of global revenue, right, for the gravest infractions. And yet we don't see this being applied to Google and Facebook, even though we know quite clearly that they are aggressively acting to violate at least the spirit, at least the intent of the law. Although there are many very expensive lawyers would argue they're in compliance under some, clever interpretation of the law. We all understand why this was passed. And if data protection authorities are not willing to apply this, what does the law actually mean? And this brings us to a profound concept that I think has been forgotten by people who live in comfortable societies. And this is the idea that the law doesn't actually protect us. We want to think the law protects us, right? But all of those structures, all of those enforcements, whether it's the police on the street, whether it's the jails we build, whether it's the fines and penalties that these things are meant to be expressed through, the law doesn't protect us, we protect the law. And when the law is not being followed, when the law is being suborned, when our collective will is being thwarted by these outside forces, and yet no one does anything about it, particularly those in our society who enjoy the most influence, the most power, the most prestige, right? The ones who are being lobbied and are lobbying in turn for favorable treatment, the meaning of law begins to break down. And I think this is fundamentally a corrosive force in the modern world. This is what leads to kind of the Hungarian and Polish type scenarios, the Donald Trump as president type scenarios. Because again, that high level of trust in society that Sweden is quite famous for, that too can and will fail if the social contract itself begins to fail, and government, rather than sort of defending it, and the public, rather than enforcing it, and through social protest, through voting and other things, sometimes simply just caring enough to say something about it, we find ourselves all too quickly in a low trust situation where tribalism, where identity becomes the most important differentiator. And this is dangerous, right? Because then it becomes every man for himself, every home against every other. And the question becomes, do we have to leave our societies in a place where success or failure is entirely reliant upon the strength and quality of our law, when we have an all too human history in every society throughout the world, that there will be times when the law and its protections uh, fail to prove reliable. Can we use other mechanisms to enforce human rights for people like Khadija, where their laws don't mean anything? They may be incredibly severe, but their enforcement is entirely selective, right? Uh, can we use fundamental forces, math, science, technology, things like encryption, to ensure that she enjoys the same rights uh, as a Belgian, as a Swede, as a Norwegian, as an American? I don't have the answer for it, but these are the things that we're struggling with today. And I worry that because of the level of expertise that is required, even to see what is happening, far too many voices are being left out of this conversation, and the public will not have had its say until it's too late.
But let's move to the situation of journalists. You already mentioned Khadija, and she was saying in the video that in her case as a journalist, it's not just about protecting herself, it's also about being able to protect her sources. And I mean, you are among the world's most famous sources. And you were certainly extremely skilled as a source. Everyone maybe isn't up to the same technical sophistication. How did you experience your role as a source and the interaction with the journalists when you wanted to come forward?
So I think the first thing to say is that it's laudable that she feels that way, that she feels journalists have a professional obligation to protect their sources, because that's not always the case in every time and place. We see increasingly journalists who protect official sources because they want to maintain their access, but they're willing to risk their sources who are in less privileged and, in fact, more vulnerable positions. Sometimes through it's through a simple negligence or ignorance. In other cases, it's, as you imply, not through any fault of theirs in terms of value, but simply it's an unfair fight. You have an ordinary journalist who has a profession that is completely unrelated to technology, and now they're thrust into a world where every communication that's passing through a Swedish fiber optic line is being tagged and indexed and added to a database in case someone wants to look through it. And this happens every time a communication hops a border. The Swedish intelligence authorities, of course, will go, oh, we're not spying on Swedes talking to other Swedes. We're focused on international communications, right? But who in Sweden really only has communications that exist entirely domestically? Anytime you connect to a major internet service, right? Their data centers are all over Europe and around the world. And as soon as you pass beyond the borders, it doesn't matter what the Swedish FRA says. It matters what Finland says. It matters what Norway says. It matters what Denmark says. It matters what Germany says. It matters what Russia says. And they don't all abide by the same standards. And so this question becomes like, when I interacted with journalists, I tried to design a system of communication in such a way that it did not matter if they screwed up. Because even if I wanted to trust them, knowing what I knew and very few outside of the intelligence services at that time knew, they could not know. And so they did not know my name until I had already left the country. And again, the reason for this is our systems are so thoroughly compromised that even the best intentioned can harm someone unintentionally. And that has to change if we are to enjoy the same kind of journalism that we've had in the past. Because all truly impactful journalism comes as a result of people in power trying to conceal a truth that for whatever reason is embarrassing to them or implicates them in some improper behavior. And someone discovers it. They find out about it and they want to say something about it, but it may be an incredible risk for them to do something or to do so. And if that's the case, again, how do we ensure that's possible in a world where every utterance, increasingly, every connection, every call, every dialing record, every text message, again, every simple website visit, records are being made? It's a tough question.
And out of your own experience as a source, actually for the last 4 or 5 years, you've been working with Freedom of the Press Foundation. You're president of the foundation, and we will also later have Parker Higgins on stage, who also works with the foundation in New York. You train journalists. Tell us a little bit about their needs and how you can help them use technology in good ways to protect their sources.
Well, that's the difficult scenario that I was just describing. Parker hopefully will have a chance to speak a little bit more to this. I'm sure he would be willing to tell anyone who's interested after the event as well. But the idea is that if we know this playing field is so unbalanced, even if we can't save the world, even if we can't fix everything immediately, how can we try to adjust the balance? How can we put our finger on the scale to make things work in the favor of the public and journalists? And so the Freedom of the Press Foundation is our effort to do so. We create a system called Secure Drop, which is used by all the major newsrooms in the world, actually, nowadays, both in the United States and outside of it. That is, its goal is to provide a kind of framework to solve the problem that I was facing that did not exist when I came forward. And that is a sort of anonymous drop box for sources anywhere to provide documents electronically to journalists without leaving a trace of their identity. To use sort of you can think of it as the digital equivalent of a shell game that's too hard to unravel, to make it so that even if they're connecting from a coffee shop in Sweden, for example, that transmission is not easily connected to the recipient, right? The people who are monitoring the New York Times or the Washington Post or Der Spiegel, whatever, they will see encrypted connections going to an anonymized routing network, but they won't see this connection coming directly from this person or directly to this journalist. And there are many other things that we are working on as well. We're tracking press freedom violations in the United States, which to our surprise, no one was actually doing. They were tracking them outside the US, but not inside the US. We're working on tools for protecting your hotel room or your home when you leave, where you can basically leave your smartphone or a sacrificial smartphone, a $20 device or an older smartphone you no longer use in your room. And it simply has its camera on, it has its microphone on, it has light sensors and movement sensors and all of these things to be able to tell, has someone entered your home or your hotel room to try to look at your laptop when you're gone, when you're working on a major story. And the idea is, can we create new tools? Can we create a new cohort of journalists who have been taught not just how to use this tool or how to use that tool, but the actual principles, the concepts underlying how modern communications networks work. So not only can they operate safely, but they can teach the rest of us how as well.
On that, we have a question from the audience. Your recommendation for the best encryption services?
Yeah, so I don't want to limit it just to encryption. The problem is when you try to answer this, it comes down to it depends, which is an unsatisfying answer people don't like. For ordinary day-to-day people, the signal messenger is the one that's most well-reviewed and secure. But you have to use your phone number, for example, to connect it to your device, which could create a risk of association. No one can tell what you're saying on this system, but they might be able to see, this phone connected to that phone. They might be able to see this phone number is a Signal user. And then they might simply knock on your door and ask you, what are you talking about on Signal? And if you don't answer, that can cause more problems for you, depending on your jurisdiction. There are other alternatives that don't require a phone number, but they're a little bit less well studied. But generally, we want to talk about higher levels of technology, right? Encryption by itself is no longer an optional choice, it is a necessity. And for those in the audience who aren't familiar with encryption, I would hope by this point most of you are. Traditionally, when communications are routed over a network, they simply pass openly. Your coffee network can see them, your internet service provider can see them, the business network of the place you're communicating with can see them, and then, of course, the final destination can see them. This is what I describe as electronically naked. Encryption simply allows people to walk down this path, their communications to pass, without having everybody peek under your skirt, basically. They can still see someone is moving along that path, but we're all wearing more or less a matching robe. So they can't tell, what you're carrying. At most, they could see where you're going. And this is a major step forward, but as you can imagine from the example, it's not the only thing we need. Particularly for journalists, we need a way to disassociate these secure communications from your identity. You don't want people to know they're coming from your phone to the phone of your source. So you need to be able to adapt devices that are not connected to your identity. This can be as simple as getting an iPod, right, and never communicating from home, never connecting it to a network that's associated to you, never visiting any personal addresses, not using it for web browsing at all, just strictly using it for communication. It goes on and on and on, but simple things like using a password manager. So every password you use on every different site is not the same one over and over again, because sites get hacked. They lose your password, it gets published on the internet, and then someone can go, oh, this is your email address at, kittycats.com, some garbage site that has no real, you weren't concerned about the security of it. But that's the same password you use for Gmail, the same password you use for Facebook, and so on and so forth. A password manager allows you to remember one password, but use different passwords for all these sites in the event of a hack. Two-factor authentication, in case your password is compromised, that's not enough to get into your account. They still need access to your phone or so on. And of course, anonymous routing. If you do not know what the Tor network is, if you do not know how a VPN works, these are things that you should look into, because as time goes on, networks are becoming ever more intrusively monitored. And if we do not start establishing a norm that ordinary people who aren't doing anything exceptional, who aren't journalists, right? They anonymize their communications. They disassociate their communications from their identity, their purchasing habits, all of these things. What you're doing is you're making journalists like Khadija, activists and dissidents all around the world more vulnerable because they are alone. They are the only ones protecting their communications. And then having safe communications becomes an identifier. What we need is for ordinary people to create sort of a herd immunity, providing a forest of ordinary lives for people at exceptional risk to live safely amongst.
And so with that argument, the universe of secure solutions that we should be using is kind of the same for the ordinary user as for the human rights defender, as for the journalist, and the more the merrier?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to what people are willing to do. A lot of ordinary individuals are not willing to put up with the inconvenience or the complexity or the difficulty of using specialist tools, even if it does make them safer, even if it does give them more power in their society, even if it does protect their influence and the influence of their neighbors, because they've got a full-time job. right? They've got other things they have to focus on. They got people to take care of. They got bills to pay, and they don't want to be bothered by all of this. They go, I've done nothing wrong. I've got nothing to hide. But the reality is, if we accept that, that argument, we forget that privacy isn't about something to hide. It's about something to protect. It's about protecting the idea of a free and open society where people can be different, where people can have unusual ideas, where people can have heretical ideas, where people can have wrong ideas and make mistakes, say something dumb and not have it haunt them for the rest of their life, even though they said it when they were 14 years old. And this is really where we get into the value of privacy. When you think about rights, right to a fair trial, right to speech, freedom of worship, where do all of these things come from? And the answer is they all derive from privacy. Privacy is the foundation of all of the rights. It's the kind of fountainhead from which other rights are derived. The right to a trial is establishing that you have a right to yourself. You have an ownership interest in what happens to you, that society has to overcome if they want to jail you, if they want to violate your right to privacy and search through your home, if they want to do any of these other things. Freedom of speech, similarly, doesn't mean anything if you don't have a space where you can think and develop ideas without the judgment of a crowd to figure out what it is that you actually want to say. Freedom of worship is meaningless if you can only inherit a doctrine and not discover for yourself the things that move you the most, that resonate with you. Even the mere idea of owning something, whether it's a pencil or a PC or a home, right? Private property has privacy built into it. And if we lose this, if we give up this stuff simply because we are lazy, simply because it's difficult or it's hard, we will very soon find ourselves in a world that reminds us the only rights that we ever have are the ones that we actually protect. A right that only exists on paper is not a right, it's an idea. It is a belief. A right that we defend, a right that we assert, a right that cannot be compromised without cost. That is a fact, and it is the only right that is real.
We have a question from the audience on the use of these technologies. Doesn't that impede legitimate law enforcement?
Sure, sometimes, absolutely. The question is, does it always, and does it matter, right? When we look at the case of terrorist attacks in Europe, for example, this is something that people forget. Europe is actually relatively peaceful. There are fewer terror attacks in the current decades, even with Islamic terrorism, than there were in the 60s and 70s when we had things like revolutionary movements in Europe. The thing is, when a bomb went off somewhere in Europe back then, it wasn't in every living room by the end of the day. So we are more terrorized by the sort of excessive and sensational method, the exploitative way of informing society, and this is by politicians just as much as by media, than we are by the facts and events themselves. In the case of, for example, the Paris attackers, these weren't people who were using exceptionally strategic methods of encrypted communications that were completely invisible, that were like some kind of ghosts or spies. No, they were using the same kind of communications that drug dealers have been using since the 1990s, simple things like burner phones. And whenever a new attack comes out, the police always say the same thing. They were in the database. These people were known to the authorities, and just somehow we missed them. Well, why? Why did we miss them? It's not because of encryption. It's not because of rights-preserving technologies. It's not because we care about rights. It's because all of these people in the surveillance organizations have been seduced by an idea that if they simply put more people on the project, if they put more money in the project, if they add a few more cameras, if they put a few more sensors in the phone company, they will be able to see everything and everyone, and from that know everything and understand everyone. But that's actually the opposite of how traditional law enforcement investigations that we've always had actually work. And the reality is this: the more you collect, the less you understand, because you have more to sort through. When you watch everything, you understand nothing. It's only by focusing, by narrowing the names of targets on the list from everyone who happened to look at an article on Wikipedia to the top 50 most dangerous people in the country. And then you actually have people close to them. You use the old means of intelligence gathering that actually work in a law enforcement context, like informants, right? And the thing is, this is simply unattractive to these officials because they have a new toy. And they do know that these programs are tremendously valuable in an entirely different context. Mass surveillance has been studied repeatedly in the United States, and there's nothing that shows that it's saved any lives at all. In fact, Barack Obama's own commissions studied this in the wake of my revelations, and they said the only investigation in which these programs made even a concrete difference was in the case of a cab driver in California wiring $8,500 to his clan in Somalia. And they said they would have gotten this information anyway through traditional means because they could have shown a judge probable cause to provide a warrant. Now, I know that's much more beyond what you asked for, but the reason I hit this so hard is, where is the value? You know, people in government, even if we don't agree with their every idea, we understand, or would like to think at least, they're normal people. And in many cases, they're good people. And in many cases, they are not stupid people, although some of them are presidents. And it's the question of, so why are they doing it? And the answer is for what they like to describe as intelligence gathering. You might not save lives with these programs because every terrorist is smart enough to know you don't say these things on a computer. You don't say these things on a phone. Why would they do that? They simply go over to their sort of evil friend's apartment and they have the conversation in person. But what if they want to know what you're doing? What if they want to know what Khadija is doing? What if they want to know what their employees are doing? Think about if you could let yourself in to the lives of any arbitrary person by typing in their email address, by typing in their phone number, by typing in their IP address, basically the number associated with your home internet connection, and they could simply see a list.
Which is what you experienced literally working at the NSA.
Literally.
That's 5 years ago with the capabilities of that time.
Absolutely.
We have a question from the audience about the social credit score in China. Now, collecting all this data, you know, with the motivation that it helps you find the needle in the haystack, that is the motivation that's given in the US. China is very blatant in going far beyond that and saying we're collecting all this data on all those people in order to build a score on all those people.
Right, and I think the troubling thing here that people are missing is they think, oh, that's China. That's all of these people who are not like us. But it's coming, and it's coming here, right? You're kidding yourself if you don't think this is what Google and Facebook and all of these other commercial entities that are not regulated well by law, if at all by law, are not doing to create the same kind of decision-making thing, right? Decisions are being made every moment of every day about every person, even if it's as simple as, what kind of ad are we going to put next to the news article you're reading? The system is the same. Only the application is different, right? If you don't think they're going to be using this to go, should we provide this person a loan? in 5 years. If you don't think they're going to be using this to approve mortgages, if you don't think they're going to be using this for all these other decisional things, eventually getting to the point of, should we hire this person? And then should we permit this person to travel? Or are they sort of an unwanted type? Are they a radical? You're missing the forest for the trees, right? China is not so much as an exception, or is not so much as an exception as it is a warning. That is the future if we do not act.
There's a lot of questions also in the thread here from the audience about positive developments.
Sure.
Which are the countries that have the best integrity policies? Which are the companies that are doing a good job on these things? And what is your dream to achieve during your lifetime? Like, what is the positive scenario that we could achieve if we're really taking care of these issues?
That was like 36 different questions. I'll try to get through as many as I can. Yeah, I mean, it's easy when we talk about the negatives, when we talk about the challenges, to become discouraged, right? But these tools and techniques are becoming easier. They're becoming more widespread. In many cases, they're already protecting you. You just don't know it. Because even these Silicon Valley guys, right? They can be moved. They can be persuaded. They can be instilled with a sort of soul, right? And while their bosses might not like this, while they may be overruled, there will be efforts for them to make available technologies and try to make them partially available if they can't make them wholly available. And Apple is actually quite a good example of this. They have taken a very strong public stance, at least, saying that, look, we are not looking to be an advertising company. We are a products company. And so unlike our competitors, we're not going to collect your data. They're now calling for sort of a new structure, new framework for regulation in the United States, a basic privacy law. And this would be a very good thing. And this is a big company, so it's positive to see that. Now, again, this does not make them faultless, right? They are actually engaged in China in ways that are socially harmful. But the question is, step by step, are things getting better or worse? And the answer is both, right? But if we already can see sort of the stairs down and can see where that's arriving, that's relatively predictable. We can see the threats. We can see facial recognition. We can see biometrics. We can see the way that governments are increasingly trying to prevent monetary transfers between people without having that intermediated by some structure, sort of outlawing truly private trade. But at the same time, what we're not accounting for on the stairs up is imagination. The fact that companies are sponsoring, organizations that are trying to do good for the world, talks like this and many others. The fact that people care, even after seeing on the news 1,000 different segments that say, oh, young people don't care about privacy. Young people care more about privacy than older generations. I speak at universities around the world, and I can tell you, they understand what it means to have a picture of them taken at a party that they didn't consent to and then seeing it appear online and causing problems for them, right? And what this means to me is it's not just the tools that we're working on, right? It's not just the efforts of Freedom of the Press Foundation. It's not just the activism and advocacy and support of groups like the Right Livelihood Association. It's about young people, writers, authors, thinkers, the bright graduate student with a new idea that people like me, right, will tell you is impossible because we've been taught that's the case. And people like me are going to be wrong. And that's the thing that gives me hope, because technology is constantly changing. And right now we are in a bad cycle, right? But when people, the human body, identifies a problem, I think given enough time, we have shown that we are actually quite good at solving it. It will be painful, and we are going to suffer significantly in trying to create this new and better future. But if you wanted to go 2,000 years in the past, right, and say, is life better back then or is life better today? Well, I know which one I would pick, even with the costs.
Thank you very much, and I'll take those as your final remarks, very fitting final remarks at a place that fosters new technology startups that care for the common good and not just their own profit. Thank you very much for being with us. Stay safe, and we really hope to see you here in person one day. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Stay free.
And now I have the great pleasure to bring two fantastic people up on the stage to discuss a little bit about what we've just heard and to put it into perspective of Sweden, human rights, the work for the press. I have the honor to have with me Anna Lindenfors, who's the director of the Swedish section of Amnesty International. Anna is an economist by training. She's worked for many years for Save the Children, did work both in Sweden and internationally, for instance, as head of Save the Children Philippines, as well as in Kenya and South Sudan. And she's also been working with the Swedish government and throughout her career been a strong defender of human rights. Welcome up on the stage, Anna. And then just arrived from New York, literally a couple of hours ago, Parker Higgins, artist, activist, and developer, now serving as Director of Special Projects at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, of which Ed is the president. Parker's writing has appeared in Wired, Gizmodo, Tech Dirt, PPS Media Shift, and other important outlets. And before working with Freedom of the Press Foundation, he was director of copyright activism at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he worked on the importance of the open web and its role in resisting censorship and surveillance. Thank you so much for coming over. Welcome, Parker. Anna, can I ask you to share your reflections on what you've heard Ed say? How does this matter to you as a human rights defender?
Oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. You know, there's so many aspects in what he's saying. I think that, but I want to pick up on one thing just to start off with, and where we're talking about the right to privacy, and he says that that's a very fundamental right. I agree on that because it is the gateway to the right to assembly, the right to freedom of speech, and all the things that human rights defenders do across the globe today, and that they're now doing also on the internet, may be curbed because of the challenges that we have on the digital area.
And this is something that you see among the partners you work with, obviously, that digital security matters. Can you illustrate this with a couple of the cases that you know of?
I can illustrate both positive and negative. Of course, we see that if you remember the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, for example, they were able to gather their people really quickly, of course, through WhatsApp and other encrypted channels that they were able to use. But we also see, we just did a research actually in Pakistan, which is, of course, really difficult to work as a human rights defender in general. but even more so now with the government's actions I mean, digitally. So we were following a woman who were really in a bad position because of this. So she was doing her usual human rights defender work, which was challenging. And then she was approached by different actors on the internet, students, it was government officials, and it turns out that these were fake identities trying to, to get into her system, get her to pass her password, etc. And it was really, really challenging for her because she wasn't that tech savvy. And I think that that's a challenge for many human rights defenders. I think that many of them who have a proper phone today would say that they would know about some of the, WhatsApp and those that were relatively safe. But there's still so much of the technology that is not available in knowing all those things.
Parker, what are your reflections? You work together to strengthen journalists in being able to really technically also protect their sources.
Yes, well,
given a lot of thought to these.
Yeah,
topics.
And it is it's wonderful to work with Ed, who, as you can tell tonight, has so many thoughts and great ideas on this. And it's always so inspiring to see him speak. And some of the other speakers tonight have just been, these are people who have really risked their lives and their livelihoods to get the truth out and to spread this information. And so it's an inspiration. I think with respect to what we heard from Ed tonight, one of the important things that he tries to get across is the idea that we need to shift the general thinking about what things like privacy are. And this happens on its own. This happens generationally, where when people say, "Oh, kids don't care about privacy," it's like, no, you're thinking about privacy wrong. If that's a conclusion that you've drawn, that people's attitudes are evolving. And that needs to apply to the technology that we're using. And so one of the things that we see at Freedom of the Press Foundation when we're working with journalists and with people who are in vulnerable populations is that there's not always a sophisticated systems thinking of how these tools work and where the privacy is being, specific aspects of privacy are being challenged, or where the technology is actually very strong. And that's something that I think is developing, and we're getting there. Yeah, maybe I'll keep it there for now. But
I mean, what you're doing practically is that you teach journalists technologies like the secure drop that he was mentioning. How can you be sure even that those are safe?
Sure, that's a great question.
His revelations are 5 years ago, so we knew what the NSA, the capabilities they had 5 years ago. How can you be sure that what you recommend to journalists is safe for them to use? Yeah,
so I think there's two answers to that, and they're kind of nested in each other. And the more technical answer, which I'll keep it brief, but it's when you're designing these tools, and when like Ed was saying, he designed the workflow with which he contacted these journalists so that things could go wrong, and that he would continue to have a pretty good impression or a pretty good guarantee of security. And that's, in design speak, that's defense in depth. And there are things you can do. So the secure drop software that we develop, it's software. We have discovered along the way bugs, and some bugs that have security implications, but because of the defense in depth, we've never been in a situation where that's been as truly as as scary as it could be. So I think that when you're designing these systems, you can design in such a way that you can accommodate bugs or flaws or things that are known in the intelligence agencies but aren't more widely known. And then when you're using the systems too, I think something that behooves especially journalists, because of the point that Khadija made about how journalists are responsible for not just their own communications but the other side of those communications. As a user, understanding the way these channels work and the way the information's actually getting from, and I gave the analogy of walking through with with the matching robe on. Understanding those systems can mean that you understand not just how they work when they work, but how they work when they fail. And this isn't. It can be in the privacy world. Sometimes we refer to a school of thought as privacy nihilism, that the intelligence agencies have an unlimited budget, and who am I, and it just doesn't matter. And in practice, we've seen that that never has to be the answer. That there are always things that people can do that give them improvements in their privacy on the margins.
Can I link up to that? I was thinking about another thing that he was saying about talking about that, well, we don't have anything to hide. And I think that I hear that a lot in Sweden, because of course people say, well, I don't have anything to hide, and we trust our government. But I think that what we should look at is really the spectre of people who are vulnerable to this situation, and most likely we will not have a government who would, add up the dots in Sweden. And I'm sure if we would have, I'm sure they could find cases with all of us and, accuse us of terrorism. But
well, who would be leading this government in Sweden? We know who would be leading such a government in Sweden, but we're not talking Swedish politics now.
And but I was also thinking, for people like Anas and Khadija and others, this is a reality every day. But I do think that we do see this in our part of the world as well. We did some research just recently in the UK with the London police, who are setting up a register of people who they think were gangs. And this was a response to some riots that was taking place in 2011. So this list was set up 2012, and last year they had almost 4,000 people on the list. And there was no real threshold to get on the list, so it was very subjective, added by the police. And not only the police had access to this, but also the housing authorities, the schools available. So once you were on the list, of course it posed problem to those that were on the list, and their siblings for that matter. But what I really want to point out is also that the same kind of discriminative behavior that we see in ordinary lives with police, we also see by the government in these instances. So there were 78% of those that were on the list were black. But the police itself, their records of actual crimes that was taking place, 27% were done by black people. So, the bias and the discrimination pattern that we see can also be reinforced, of course, and malused with this. So I think it's not only something that is far away and it's really technical. It's something that's actually here in our society. We had the register of Roma people in the southern part of Sweden not long ago also. So we're not immune on this. We need to make the dots and the connections between the tech-savvy people and the human rights defenders, and see how we can actually reinforce their space for freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. So
absolutely. And I do want to say, it's sometimes easiest for people to conceive of threats to privacy and to personal freedom and liberty sort of things that come in a package that we call Orwellian, that is a repressive government, a bad guy up at the top, a big brother, and that person is targeting someone who is doing good and just, hammering down on them in particular. And in practice, and that's really what drives the question. Well, I have nothing to hide, so what do I have to fear? I'm never going to be the Winston Smith that's targeted by Big Brother. But in practice, what we see, and what we've seen especially since 2001 in the US, is a situation that's more Kafkaesque. That it's not because you've done something wrong or you have something to hide or you pissed off the wrong person. But your name appears on a list. Your phone walked by a protest. Your cousin submitted their DNA to a registry, and their cousin did. And this sort of thing, where now you're the target of something. And in some cases, you know, like Ed was giving the examples of the ways in which, and this is for, you know, everyday people, you know, not people who consider themselves especially vulnerable or marginalized. The ways in which you can imagine that data being used against you just in the next 5 years about like your credit worthiness and your ability to access certain information. And that is scary for the straightforward reasons, but also in the way that like these lists that you were uncovering and documenting, there's not an appeal process. And in some cases, there's not even someone who knows why are these 4,000 names on this list. And that's what we found in the US with the no-fly list. There's no one at the end of that line who can answer that question. And so that lack of accountability is part and parcel with the sort of Kafkaesque model of privacy violations.
I really agree, and I think that the whole issue of proportionality, there's no proportionality.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like access to everybody, everywhere. Whereas in real life, you would need the search warrants. You would need. I mean, there's a whole range of laws limiting and holding people accountable to all these things and making sure that there are secure steps to take. At least if you have a rule of law country,
right?
That you know that in order for anyone to get access to your private information, but on the internet, there's no proportionality, and I think that's really important that we raise those issues. And of course, I mean, what we're talking now is really negative and a gloomy picture of the world. And I think that we should be aware of that, just like Edward Snowden saying. I mean, this is we're in for some tough situations. But on the other hand, I think it's just people like us who can actually make that change. And you were mentioning the IPPC. And the big report, and there's actually a similar initiative going on with social scientists. I can't remember the name, but they just also released a report. And what they're saying is that if we want to see the changes in society, it's really the grassroots movement people like us, people like Anas, people like Khadija, you know, who could make that change. So I think that there's lots of hope in that as well. But of course, we'll have to stand up and not being naive here in Sweden because we're in a privileged situation, but we need to think of solidarity and how we can actually stand up to those that are most prone to be violated.
And at least those of us who are working in some way or the other in progressive movements, if you wish, or for universal human rights, we should be aware of the technologies that we use to communicate in a protected way. And it was encouraging to hear that on the journalist side, it was said before that most newsrooms are now using the secure drop. So journalists are aware, but you know international civil society very well, you know human rights defenders in your networks. How well aware are they?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Both of them. I was meaning Anna, but
go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start. I think it differs. Different what kind of context that you're in, but I think that, I was in the northern part of Uganda, and that was quite some time back, and they were sitting there surfing on their mobile phone. There was no infrastructure when it comes to physical, like proper roads, proper education, schools and stuff like that, but the internet was there. So, to some extent I think that they're there, but they don't have the technology and the knowledge like maybe the journalists that you're working with, and having access to that. So I think that is the challenge.
And when the different Amnesty sections are meeting at their annual meeting in London, are you talking about data protection? Are you getting these trainings that journalists are getting, or
we actually
could
have
more be done?
We have a specific group of people that we've had for quite a few years now working on technological development in a wider spectrum, also with the IA and and the linkages to human rights, because we see that there's going to be huge changes going forward in this field, and it will challenge human rights in many ways. How will it apply? When it comes to robots, and where are the boundaries? There's going to be big changes going forward, and I think that's going to be challenging for the economic, social, cultural rights as well as the civil, political rights. Maybe you want to add.
I think it's time to start to ask the final question.
And the final question is, I'm looking at the screen there, but they seem to be very much directed to Ed. Still, my final question to you guys will then be: where do you see us going? Where do you see these developments, and especially, where do you see hope? Where do you see the positive developments, and what do we need to do? It's always nice to dream about the future. What do we need to do here and now to make the positive developments happen?
Do you want to start on this?
I can start, yeah. So, we're at about 5 years since the Snowden revelations, 5 years since they started, and we're still at the 5-year anniversary of individual stories. And at the time, Ed had said, it was part of his sort of regular talking points, that he was concerned that maybe nothing was going to happen. That maybe people were going to take this and read it on the front page, and then a couple weeks later read it on the third page, and then it would go away. And what we've seen in 5 years, that's not the case, and that's not the case in how people talk about it. That we can have an event on privacy on a busy night, and a lot of people come out for it, and that's great. But it's also not the case in the way that our security tools and even non-security tools, general purpose tools, are being designed, and that is getting in fits and starts better and better. And so today, the way that you use the internet, more of that tends to be more secure than 5 years ago. And there's definitely places where we're backsliding. And there's a lot of ways where that's not the case. But I think it's the idea of a code of ethics and a code of privacy being part of the tool designers, the thing that goes into that is encouraging.
So I'll start with the gloomy part. I think that we've seen for several years our government has undermined human rights and the institutions that are really set to protect them. And it has changed for the worse. We know Poland, Hungary, the US, the Philippines. We can name a whole range of countries going in the wrong direction. At the same time, we have seen people stepping up. Ordinary people, just mobilizing and engaging themselves in different issues. And of course, you're most welcome to engage yourself in Amnesty, but there's other organizations as well. But don't do something. And it doesn't have to be a lot, just a small thing, whatever you feel like doing, and picking an area where you think is important. This could be an area, but we talked about, the right to privacy and to engage yourself in that. Don't just let this, train go in the wrong direction. We are the ones who are building our future. We'll have to take that responsibility. We're grown-up people. We can do that.
Yeah, I think you've just invented the new tagline for Amnesty International, better even than Nike's slogan, don't just don't. That's the final word from the panel here. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Ole, Parker, and Anna.